Yes.
Yeah. All right. Cool. So I'm also showing magnetic processing code. So it's set up a little bit differently than Troy's. So I'm hoping maybe showing everybody a different way to sort of step through your process, even if you're working on similar data sets as somebody else. So the specific goal I had with this code was sort of like what Grant was saying. My first couple of semesters was just frantically writing code. So then I wanted to take all that code and manage it and put it in a way that I could go back to my code and know what I did and process my data in a similar way if I'm going to another magnetic survey and need to process the same sort of data. And my data specifically with a drone-based magnetic survey. So my data is set up a little bit differently than Troy's is. So the first thing is obviously import your libraries. Make sure I'm doing it a little bit differently. I'm importing specific whole libraries, and then I'm also, like for math, I'm only importing the specific functions that I need. You can do it either way. And so the way my data, or my functions are wrapped up, they're all wrapped up in a Python class, which I don't think we've gone over yet. But a Python class, I think, is a good way to sort of wrap up your variables and your functions you want to use into one package. So the main variables that I'm looking at using is one I'm calling parameters, which is a Python dictionary of my input, of some input parameters, a data variable that is just a pandas data frame of whatever my input file is, and then one called lines. This starts out as not populated, but when I'm starting to separate my data into individual survey lines, that will be populated with those individual lines. So my class, I'm just calling it mag app for magnetic application. This is defining the class. There's a couple different ways I have it defining depending on what I'm doing exactly. The normal way is just here. In Python, self dot is a way for a class to reference itself or reference data within it. And then after that, I have all of my different functions that I use that call upon these different variables. So I have I'm using what Troy mentioned, the easier way of, or maybe the simpler way of transforming your data with just the EPSG codes. And this is a function just taken right from PyProj's website. I have a function that calculates the distance between points of my data, which I will then use in this function below called split lines, which will use the distance between points to separate the lines out. So if your points are close together, then they're a single line. If they're far away, they're a separate line. And then I have a function that, again, looks at successive points and gets their heading. And then I have functions for both north-south and east-west lines that looks at those headings and determines if for the north-south function, if it's a north-south heading point, and it keeps it. If it is not, it gets rid of it. So it's a way to sort of clean up your data in case you have lines in a single survey that are both north-south and east-west, which in the case of drone surveying we do, and we'll see that in a minute. Then, like Troy's functions, I have subtracting from the total field, and mine is just you give it the value you want, which you have to go to the same sort of thing, the NOAA IGRF website, and find your value. And then I also have subtracting the mean out of your data to center it around 0. And then if you just want to extract a single line from your data points, I have this function here where you define a line, and it uses a GeoPandas data frame to extract that line. It's a non-visual way to cut your data with a polygon. If you've ever used ArcGIS or QGIS, you can sort of, if you're working in there with point data, you can define a define a shape and clip your data. This function does the same thing. It's just doing it Pythonically. And then I have a detrend function, which if there's a anomalous trend in your data, so if your data is not centered around 0, it looks at the beginning point and end point of your data, calculates a line between those points and subtracts it. And then I have some additional helper functions that just sort of make my processing a little bit easier. They're nothing to do with the actual processing of the magnetic data. So like this function looks at all of the files in a directory and turns it into a Python dictionary. That way it's easier to collect a bunch of files, file paths at once. And these are called by some of these other functions inside my class. And then, like Troy, I also have some plotting functions. This is all matplotlib, but then some if-else statements depending on what variables I pass to them. So then we can actually get to the processing of the data. So my first example is the processing manipulation of a single data file. So as I was saying, you have to set up a parameters dictionary, which takes in a file path. So the dictionaries are key value pairs. So my key is file path. My value is just the string file path to my data, which is in the data folder. Then I have the input EPSG code, which is the EPSG code my data is in, which is WGIS84. And then I have the EPSG code I would like to transform my data into. And this is just the UTM EPSG code. So the way this works is you pass your parameters dictionary into your object. You can give your object any name you want. I just call it magapp1. And this will automatically take your file path and turn it into a pandas data frame. I can scroll back up and show that. Right here, where it's read CSV parameters keyword file path. And you have to make sure it's got the right separating value, which in this case it's space separated instead of comma separated. And then we just check that the file path is there and it's correct. And then we also check that our data is in fact in a pandas data frame. And then I can use my simple plot function, which, as it says, it simply just plots the XY values. And I have a little extra line in there that looks at my file path and puts that as the title, so you know what file you're looking at. And this is what our magnetic survey data, our drone magnetic survey data looks like. It's been slightly pre-processed where the corners have been removed. That's due to the engine of the drone accelerating through those corners, so it can mess with our magnetic values. So we can see that we have these long lines that are the true survey lines, north-south, and then we have these turning lines that are shorter throughout our data. So now after we've initialized our mag app class, we can actually start using those inbuilt functions, those inbuilt methods, as a way to process our data. And as I was saying, the reason why I like classes is because once you give it the initial parameters, ideally, there isn't much you need to actually pass through. It just runs on those parameters, referencing them within itself. So the first function I will do is the transform coordinates function. And I've just copied and pasted the function here so you can see what it's doing. So I just have it magapp1, and to use the function, just like with NumPy, you do np.sum or np.whatever. It's the same sort of thing here. You do magapp1.transform chords, and because it already knows what those EPSG codes are, it just does it automatically without you needing to tell it anything. And then I'm printing it out here, and you see we have two new columns, easting and northern. And to answer Franco's question from Troy, this is the only function I think you really have to run for the rest of the functions within the class to work. Most of them work on easting and northing values. Otherwise, you can run the other functions in whatever order you want. So the next step is I would like to separate my data into individual lines. And the way I found easiest to do for just a single file of data is to calculate the distance between the points and then separate it based on that distance. So the first thing I do is I call the getDistance function, which it's like it sounds. It looks at point 1, looks at point 2, and gets the distance between them. The only thing you have to do is make sure you insert a 0 for the first point, because obviously there's no point for it to have a distance from. And then I use a split lines function. It's been a while since I've wrote this function, so it can definitely be cleaned up. But essentially, what it's trying to do is it looks at the distance from point to point. And when the distance from, let's say, point 10 to point 11 jumps, when it's a very large distance, it knows from point 1 to point 10 is a single line. Then it restarts its search with point 11, looking for the next big jump in your distance. So I can call split lines, and then if you see at the end of this function that self.lines, that lines parameter I showed at the beginning, gets populated. So now I can call magapp.lines, and it's a dictionary as well. So you call the key, so line 1, or if I want to do if I have other lines like line 5, I can call line 5, and it shows me what line 5 looks like. And then you can again call simple plot, but in this case, you add in that the lines equal true. So that way it knows, instead of looking at magapp.data, it looks at magapp.lines. That way then it plots the individual lines. And matplotlib automatically colors different plotted sections differently. You don't need to do that. It just cycles through these colors and restarts. And then I have some other plotting functions where I have plot mag profile, where you again pass it the application. You give it the name of the line you want. So in this case, it's line 5. And then you tell it what direction to plot the data in. So you're telling it it's plotting a north-south line. So here you can see the magnetic trend of that line. And then one more function in this section, you can plot an offset profile. So you again pass the magapp itself. It knows what parameters to pull from that. Tell it it's plotting north-south lines, and it plots all of your lines with an offset between them. So that way, these aren't the real values, but you can see relative to one another what the data looks like. And in this case, we're looking at data over top of, I should have mentioned at the beginning, actually. We're looking at data from little cones, 2 scoria cones out in Crater Flats, Nevada. And this magnetic, it's reversely magnetized. So this magnetic anomaly we're seeing here is partially from one of the cones. The cone has a breakout section to the south. So we're seeing these 2 sides of the cone with the breakout. So now I wanted to look at, well, I have the code working for a single file. So the know it's working for a single file, I can probably just run on all of my files. So what I'm doing here is using one of my helper functions to create a Python dictionary that holds all of my different files that are in the data folder. That's all this is just, it's giving it an index, and it's giving the file path. And what I can do with that is I can set up a loop, a processing loop, to process all of my files in the same way. So that way I know file 1 and file 35 are going to get the same sort of processing. There's no mistake in typing from one to the other. Or I guess if there is, it'd be in all of them. So you just have to reprocess it. And the one thing differently I'm doing here is I'm looking at the heading of the files, and then using that heading, cutting the data. So if the data is primarily north-south lines, so like above here, if the data is primarily north-south like this, it's going to cut out these east-west lines. that I don't want because they're really short lines and don't really add much. And then vice versa. If it's an east-west line, it's going to be rotated. So your short lines are going to be north-south, and you don't want those. So that's what these functions are doing here is you're simply calculating the heading here, and there's a lookup function that looks up what the degrees is based on the heading. And then if the degrees are within north-south with the buffer, I have a buffer of about 5 degrees, then it keeps those ones. If it's not, it gets rid of them. So that's what this is doing here. It's taking your dictionary of file paths and cycling through those, putting that file path in your parameters dictionary, and then creating a new app and doing the same processing to each one. It's transforming them, it's getting the heading, it's cutting the heading based off the mode heading, so based off the most common heading. And then it's taking all of that data and putting that into a dictionary. So now we have, I couldn't find a better way to do this. I know it's a bit confusing, but now we have a dictionary of pandas data frames. So we have all of our data files over here in data processed the same way and set up so that we can call on each one individually if we want to. In this case, I'm taking all of those pandas data frames and using pandas concat. And this is just a function that calls that to concatenate all of these data frames into a single data frame. So now we see we have a data frame that's 6 columns and what is this, 83,000 rows approximately. So now we create a mag app with all of this data inside of it. Now we have our app with all of this data that we can then plot. So this is what all of the data looks like clean. We see our north-south lines are north-south with no small east-west lines. And then down here, our east-west lines are all single long lines with no north-south lines. And then we can see the different chunks of this data, how we sort of ran the survey. We see we have a tighter grid up here, and then we have other longer grids up here. So now we can go and clean up the magnetic signal. Similar to what Troy did, we subtract the total field, and in this case, I'm just giving a value that I already found by going to the NOAA IGRF website. And then I also subtract the mean. And these are just pretty simple functions where you just take your pandas column minus equals whatever the value is. And the same thing, the pandas column that holds your magnetic signal data minus equals the mean of the data. And then an interesting visualization that's inherent in pandas that I kind of like is the box plot as a way to visualize your data. So now we can see with our data cleaned, it's centered around 0, which is what we want. But then we can also see our more positive and our more negative data values. And because from looking at the literature, I know that this area is reversely magnetized, it makes sense that a lot more of my data points are down here in the negatives. And then we see we have some outlier negative data points as well, which in this case, I believe correspond to the actual cinder cones themselves, whereas these lesser negative points are the magnetic signal from the flow around the cones. And now we get into sort of prepping our data, prepping a single data line for forward modeling, which is sort of ultimately the goal of this notebook. So what we do is, as I described above, we use GeoPandas. So we define a line with endpoints. We call this line to polygon function, which creates a GeoPandas polygon, again, similar to ArcGIS or QGIS, creating a square or a circle to clip your data with. And then it uses that shape file, essentially, to clip the data inside of that. So it's magapp.getSingleLine. You give it the line parameters, you give it endpoints, and then you give it the shape to look inside. So we can see here, if we call on lines, we see we only have one line, which is what we want because we only defined one line. And this is the data we can work on. This is, again, those same plotting functions, just to plot the data, just to make sure you actually do have a single line. There's no sort of erroneous points kept in. And then here's the magnetic signal of that line. And as I was saying, this data isn't quite centered around 0 because there is some other magnetic trend that is causing a tilt in my data. So to do this, to get rid of that tilt, I simply defined a detrend function, which looks at the beginning points and end points, calculates a line, and then subtracts the line from those points, which will then allow your data to be centered around 0. And now we get into the forward modeling of the data. This is based off of Pluff. So again, with our Python classes, I've created a class for the model. This will take all of your model inputs and run your model based on your inputs. So we have several inputs. We have the actual data frame, that's the line that we just cut out. We have another file that is becomes a pandas data frame that is the actual geometry of the anomaly, or what you think the geometry is. It's just a shapefile of eastings and northings. You have what your top bound of your anomaly is, your bottom bound. Then you have your inclination and declination of your rock of your magnetic signal. And then you have an intensity of magnetization that you want to try out for your model. So again, our model gets initiated here with all of these parameters, and then it has a results and residuals attribute that aren't populated at the beginning because it's only populated once you actually run the code. We have some functions here that center our line and center our shape, so that way they're both centered around 0 relative to each other. And then we have the actual Pluff code itself, which is a long series of mathematical equations that calculate the magnetic signal based on the geometry you've given. At the end of which, we then define, we define a observed mag and a distance along the line for that observed mag that we can plot later on. And then this is our run, our actual function that runs the model, that calls those center functions, and then just passes in your shape values into the model, the actual model running function. Then we also have a function here that calculates the residuals for you. So this is what it looks like, similar to the class earlier. You pass in your different variables you want. So here I'm giving it the line we established earlier. I'm giving it the pandas read CSV function that takes in the shapefile, and then I'm defining the top, bottom bounds, inclination, declination, and the intensity I want to try out. So here, if you run this, you can just detect and make sure that your shapefile got read in correctly. We see it's read in correctly here with our eastings and our northings. I have a function here that just plots our shape and our line, so we can see that the observed line from a top-down view, and then the shape as well from the top-down view. And then here, like as before, I tried to make this as simple as possible, where you just call the run_pluff function, and it runs for you, and then at the end it prints out the results, so you know it's printed, it's resulted in something. And then you can plot the model with the observed and the model results here. So our green line is our observed, and our red line is our calculated. So we can see we've got a pretty decent match. There's some mismatch here on the right side of the equation, but that's what I like about the way I've organized this, is that I can go back up here, simply change a couple variables here, and run it again and see if I get a better fit. You can print out the residuals and look at those, and those residuals you can then use for some different statistical calculations. So down here I've got a root mean square error calculation. I didn't put this in a function because it's a pretty simple code to write out and run. And then a Durbin-Watson statistic, which I believe we saw earlier in the semester. This statistic you want to be around 2. If it's not around 2, there's some sort of systematic error in your code. In this case, I would, if I had to guess, I would say it's due to the shape of the anomaly I'm giving it. There's a portion of the model that portion of the observed that isn't explained by the modeled shape. And that is all I have.
Cool.
Any questions? I know it was a lot if we haven't gone over classes before, if you haven't seen them before.
That's very cool. Robert, do you have a picture of the final magnetic map?
I could probably get one. I don't have one on. I have to probably look at my email. I don't have one on this computer. I'm on my home computer.
Oh, okay. Well, no problem. It's just really cool looking. So what about GeoPandas? Is that useful to use? I mean, why are you using GeoPandas as opposed to just pandas?
So honestly, GeoPandas I was using as a sort of last resort. I was having trouble. If I scroll up, I was having trouble just sort of picking out a single line from all of this data.
Yeah, no kidding.
So, yeah. So I ended up finding out that with GeoPandas, I can go up to the actual functions. We can look at it. So line to polygon is really where I'm using GeoPandas. I found it with GeoPandas, if you give it a start and end point of a line string object, which is inside GeoPandas, if you give it a line, a shapefile basically, it's a line with a start and end point, then you can use what they call a geoseries with a buffer, which that is what actually creates your basically creates your polygon. So that's what I'm using, is I can define, instead of having to go into QGIS, import my data, manually draw like a square around the data I want, and then bring that back into Python. This is a way to do that just inside Python. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be using GeoPandas. But yeah, that was just the simplest way I found to sort of define a line using endpoints and extract that from my data. So that way you can sort of get fine detailed with that buffer. You can, if you want to extract more data, you can make that buffer bigger. If you want to extract less, you can make that buffer smaller.
Gotcha.
And the buffer is in units. It's in the units of whatever your data is in. So it's in meters.
Yeah.
I know I have seen people use GeoPandas for like plotting and stuff like that as well. It's a way of instead of having a column that's easting and northing, you'd have a column that's called geometry, where each point would have a tuple or a tuple that was comprised of that easting and northing. It's just another sort of way to work with geographic data in Python.
Interesting. So you needed the GeoPandas because you had blocks of data and the lines went between blocks, right?
Yeah, and if you can see when I plotted that individual line down here, that it's not exactly straight north-south. And that's sort of what made it complicated. So that's why I had the idea of sort of defining it by its endpoints.
Right.
Otherwise, if they were a little bit straighter north-south, I think you could probably get away with doing it a little bit differently.
That's super interesting. So you can wind up including an inversion with your Pluff algorithm to try to optimize the parameters.
Yes, yeah, I did have, I didn't include it, but I did have a grid search function that you would give it. There's sklearn is a machine learning Python library. I think we've gone over it, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But that has a function that you give it all of your parameters that you want to try out, and it creates a dictionary with all the different combinations of those parameters.
Nice.
So I had a function that would loop through those different combinations, but for some reason Python doesn't like making my my class more than once.
Oh, interesting. Huh.
It would,
Okay.
yeah, so I had it trying to running different models and basically looking at the RMSE and then tell me which one had the best or the lowest RMSE. But whenever it would try to run the second set of combination of parameters, it would basically it would run, but it would basically just give me like all like nonsense values.
Huh. Well,
So I am trying to do something like that. At the very least, just a grid search, just a sort of a basic version of running through all the different combinations. But yeah, for some reason, there's something inside Python that I've not quite figured out yet.
right. Well, true for all of us. But I mean, it's interesting that it has trouble. I guess I didn't understand, why do you have to build the class each time? You don't really need to, right?
Yeah, I guess you
I
don't
guess,
really need to. You would just have to. You'd substitute in the values, like in this step here, you'd substitute in the values. Yeah, I've not tried that. Every time I do it, I do the equal. So I make a new variable. It's the same name, but I re-instantiate it.
Yeah.
So yeah, actually, that's something I haven't thought about.
Well, if you move the vertices, you would have to anyway. I guess you're not
Yeah,
passing vertices.
yeah, because every loop through, I was passing it a different, one
there
of
you
these
go,
values
yeah.
would change.
Right. Nice. Anybody else have some questions for Robert? All right. Well, it's a good lesson to work through on how to deal with lots of data. Jeez, how many data points were in the survey?
So something I didn't mention was the data I was working with was resampled from 200 hertz to 5 hertz. So yeah, I don't remember how many data points, but it was 83,000 rows. Oh yeah, 83,000 rows, 83,000 data points.
Yeah. It's pretty cool, but that's downsampled.
Yeah.
From 40 times that.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's the one nice thing about drone magnetics is you get a lot of data, you get a high density of data, but then you have to figure out how to work with all that data.
Yeah. Wild. Okay. Anybody else have any questions today for anybody? Comments? You guys are good. Okay. Well, look, thanks a lot to all the speakers again. Good job. That was really informative from everybody, and I learned a lot. That was cool. So I think I'll stop recording at that point.